All right, I have officially done 50 episodes of Wildfire Insider, so I thought in this episode I would just try to do a concise summary of some of the key lessons that I learned. And I feel like episode 50 actually was maybe as far as I've taken this philosophy about wildfire so far, but it was a bit of a long video. I think it ended up coming out to about 30 minutes. So I thought in this one, I might just try to take what I was trying to say yesterday and hopefully make it a bit more concise. And maybe not off to the best start already because I've maybe already been rambling. So I'll just try to get right into it. I started off the video yesterday by saying I had a conversation with someone, and in the conversation they asked me, is wildfire no longer a problem in California? And the reason that they were asking this is because, well, we haven't had a lot of wildfire activity over the last 2 seasons. And that was what I explained when I responded to that question, as I said, that's true. We didn't have a lot of wildfire activity this last year. For example, at this point in the year, we've normally burned 1.5 million acres, but this year we've only burned around 300,000. And the fires that we did have were in pretty unpopulated areas. So that's why you didn't hear a lot about it. And the reason that happened is because we picked up so much rainfall last winter. Much of California saw 2 to even 3 times as much rain as we normally get in a year. That brings a lot more moisture back into your fuels. Anyone who's ever started a campfire knows that it's much harder to start a fire if you have a moist log. So that's basically why wildfire activity wasn't as bad. Less fires start because there's more moisture in the fuel, and then the fires that do start don't become as extreme. So I said that in this conversation I had yesterday, but then he responded perfectly and he said, yeah, but doesn't that just mean wildfires could actually be worse in the future because all that rain just leads to more fuel? And that is exactly true. We're in California, which means we have periods of very wet years and then periods of very dry years. We kind of have it's almost like our climate in California likes to behave in extremes. And even in the rainy years, it's not usually steady rainfall. It'll usually be 5 giant storms where all the rain comes from. You call them atmospheric rivers or pineapple expresses. So eventually we're going to dry out. And once we dry out, we will have a lot more fuel. And that will set the stage for more extreme wildfires. So even though it feels like we're maybe in the clear because the last 2 years, not all that much has happened. Obviously, there have been some bad things and some bad occurrences, but it's just in comparison to what we maybe got used to in California, it would seem like the problem is maybe being solved. But it's more like right now we're just on a temporary little pause because of some favorable climate conditions. But eventually that pause is going to end, and then we've maybe just been kicking a can down the road to something that could be even worse in the future. Now, I don't say that to try to scare anybody. I say that because the reason I've done 50 episodes of Wildfire Insider and the reason I'm reading Fire in California's Ecosystems is because I was trying to investigate this problem of wildfire being a problem in California. And I think that's one of the key ideas that I have learned over the last 50 episodes is that wildfire isn't actually a problem in California. So you can almost pause right there to let it sink in because that sounds like a ridiculous statement. Anybody who's lived through the last decade in California, I lived up in the Santa Cruz Mountains when we had a CZU lightning complex on one side of me and then the SCU lightning complex on the other side. Ash coming from both directions, while at the same time there's hundreds of fires burning throughout the state. In the last decade, thousands of structures have been destroyed, countless lives lost. So it seems kind of ridiculous, out of touch, or maybe even naive, or hopefully nothing worse than that, to say that wildfire is not a problem in California. But it's because that statement is too simple. So what I've been learning as I've been reading this textbook is that wildfire, we shouldn't view wildfire as a disturbance to the California environment. Wildfire is part of the California environment. So just the same as we have temperature, we have soil, we have wind, we have precipitation, we have wildfire as well. And just the same as your temperatures and the amount of rainfall you get and the type of soils you have will determine what kind of trees you have, wildfire has also been around throughout that evolutionary process, and it's shaped the vegetation and some of the animals that we have in California. So it's not like wildfire is some bad outside force that ruins the otherwise perfect California environment. It's actually a part of the environment, and a lot of plants actually require wildfire in order to continue to survive. And it's the suppression of wildfire and the lack of wildfire that is actually leading to what you could view as the actual problem. So what you would say instead of wildfire has become a problem in California, if you're looking at the overall last decade, you would say extreme wildfire due to an accumulation of fuels that has happened because of a history of fire suppression, because we view wildfire as the enemy, while simultaneously conditions are getting hotter and drier, while simultaneously more people are moving into the wildland-urban interface, which puts more life and property at risk, but then also leads to more ignitions. That whole thing leads to more extreme wildfire that does put more property and life at risk, and that is a problem. So you see why I wanted to have the old problem before, where I just say wildfire has become a problem in California. Obviously, that's a lot more simple of a sentence. That's a lot easier to follow, but that sentence isn't actually true. In fact, it might be the opposite of true. I say it's the opposite of true because it's a lack of wildfire that is maybe the problem in California. And I never want to try to come off like I'm saying exactly what I know is true now. I'm slowly learning all of these ideas and changing them along the way as my understanding of this overall subject becomes a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex. So that's the first part of this, saying that wildfire is not exactly the problem. It's just the specific part of wildfire that's a problem. And then there are some solutions that we can put in place to alleviate that problem. So what I said is a big part of it is the fact that we have a lot of fire suppression, which allows fuels to accumulate. So then when a fire does come through, it leads to a much more extreme wildfire, especially if you have hotter, drier conditions than in previous decades. And then that just overwhelms our ability to suppress the fire, and then that puts a lot more lives and property at risk. So one way we could kind of interfere in that little feedback loop that we have is we could allow more fire to happen, and we could put more fire on the ground when conditions are favorable. Because wildfire is a natural part of the California ecosystem. So we should almost change our mindset from viewing fire as something bad to viewing fire as something that's naturally part of California. And instead of trying to suppress it, we need to learn to live with it and adapt ourselves to it. And what I think is actually pretty cool, there's a whole section about Native Americans in this textbook. We can also learn to use it to our advantage. And this was something that I was talking about yesterday, is if we could get to a point in California where we all had defensible space, we all knew our evacuation routes, our communities were set up in a way that, almost like what we do with earthquakes, we don't move all of our buildings off of fault lines in California. I think you'd have to move all of San Francisco if you did that. We just build our buildings in a way that makes them earthquake proof. So I'm not going to say everyone needs to move out of the forest. Maybe we just need to put in more fire resistant housing. And there's actually some pretty cool companies popping up that make these pretty awesome fire resistant cabins. And then if you have a defensible space around that, then that immediately takes down a lot of the risk. And then you imagine if every single person within the wildland or urban interface started to adapt their housing and their living situations towards something that is more in tune with the natural California environment, which has wildfire, then we would be in a lot better position. So that's one part of it. The other part that I was talking about yesterday is we also can't just view it as, well, I should maybe conclude what I was trying to say right there. What I was trying to say is that we can use fire to our advantage. And by that I mean, if we had all these fire-resistant houses, if we knew our evacuation routes perfectly, if we set up our communities in a way that made them much more resistant to wildfire, then when a fire comes through or it's near that community, we could actually view it as a good thing that would be to our advantage, because it would clear out a lot of the fuels that maybe we haven't cleared out already. It would maybe return that ecosystem back to where it should be, back to its more normal fire return interval, maybe bring it back to its more natural fire regime, and maybe to a place that the plants actually like a lot more, with reduced fuels that would deter extreme wildfire in the future. That could be a very nice system that we could be living in. But then there's a flaw in that argument, because the flaw in that argument is, oh, more fire, the better. But as I've learned in this book, anytime I try to put forward something simple, like wildfire is a problem, or the key to solving the wildfire problem is more prescribed burning and more fire, every time I put forward one of those simple ideas, I learn that I'm wrong. Or I'm maybe not wrong, I have one piece of the puzzle, but there is much more complexity than I maybe would like to admit. So what I mean by that is, what I especially have learned over the last 2 months as I've been reading this textbook, almost 2 months now, is that we can't only be viewing this as from a wildfire framework, because wildfire is nested in the ecosystem, and wildfire is connected to the entire ecosystem. It's connected to the soil, it's connected to the water, it's connected to the air. So, for example, if we were to take that idea that I probably believed when I started this series of more fire is the answer, use it to clear out fuels, that solves extreme wildfire. That does seem simple. But then, some examples I've learned. After you put fire on the ground, the soils become a lot more water repellent, which leads to, when a storm comes through, you have a lot more water just rushing down hillsides, which leads to more erosion, more mudslides, more debris flows, more flooding. And obviously, that has negative consequences. On top of that, it could lead to worse quality water within your streams, because it's maybe rushing down a lot of, mud or murkiness that maybe the fish don't like as they're trying to swim up the river. I believe that's something that's happened with salmon. And then on top of that, you have air. You put a bunch of fire on the ground, all of a sudden your air quality's bad, and now maybe hundreds to if not thousands of people have negative health effects because of the pollutants that we've put into the air. But then, playing devil's advocate again, if you don't put the fire on the ground, then the fuels just continue to accumulate, and then eventually a fire is going to come through. And because we weren't good stewards of that environment, maybe, depends on the environment you're talking about, then eventually a fire comes through and it ends up being way more extreme than it needed to be, or it should have been if it was in its natural fire regime, where maybe fire is a bit more frequent and consistent. So you end up with a much more extreme wildfire that puts a bunch of life and property at risk. And then if you're still looking at the air quality impact, maybe that just leads to way worse air quality that ends up impacting millions of people. So I'm almost purposely trying to make it complex as I'm describing all those different interacting factors right there, with the purpose of putting forward the idea that this is a very complex problem, and that's just the tip of the iceberg right there. I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot more as I go through the rest of this, and that because each little bioregion in California is different, and then within those bioregions, you have different fire return intervals, you've had different periods of fire in the past, you have different vegetation, And all of that's going to lead, you have different communities, different populations, and that's going to lead to different solutions. But what I have been talking about recently is that there actually isn't solutions, there are only trade-offs. So maybe we decide there hasn't been a fire in 50 years in this area, the fuels are accumulating too much. The forecast today is pretty favorable for a prescribed burn, so all right, we're going to put some fire on the ground, clear out those fuels. But then we have to deal with the air quality and maybe increased erosion the next time a storm comes through. And that's maybe the trade-off that we have. Or we decide the opposite and we just risk that extreme fire maybe 10 years down the road and we keep kicking the can down the road. So each system is very complex and we want to deal with it at as local a scale as possible because each individual community is going to be very different from the next. So if you take one thing out of this episode today, it's that if you ever hear a generalization about what we need to do about wildfire, or even what the problem is with wildfire, you should become skeptical of whatever that person is saying, because in reality, it's very complex, and the solutions are trade-offs, and they're going to be different for everybody. And in each individual area, the problem itself might be a little bit different. So then the next question might come up where you think, all right, well, that sounds very complex. It kind of makes you want to just throw up your hands and say, yeah, that sounds like too big of a problem. I'm not going to read a textbook. To be honest, as I've read this textbook, it just makes me realize how much I didn't know before. So if anything, it might decrease my confidence in my ability to, I don't want to say like tell people what we should be doing about wildfire, because I don't think I've ever thought of that as my role. But I would say I'm less confident in my knowledge of wildfire than actually when I started reading this textbook, which is somewhat ironic, but I think that is a process of learning. Whereas you learn more, you realize how much more you still have to learn. So I understand that feeling of throwing up your hands and saying, okay, this problem's too complex. Let's just tap out. Maybe I'll just focus on politics or something else that on the surface may seem simpler, but that tends to just be as nuanced and complex as well. So then my response to that would be, don't pull back too quickly, because there are things that we can do on an individual level, and it's actually very actionable steps that if every person in California did these actionable steps, we would pretty much solve that problem that seems extremely complex. Just in doing maybe a few things that we know would be right for us. And by that, some easy ones: defensible space, evacuation plan. That kind of gets your own house in order, knowing what you need to do. Getting your house as safe as you possibly could, making it easier for firefighters to defend. And then once you get your house in order, you can maybe talk to your neighbors and tell them how to create their defensible space. Because at the end of the day, if their house catches on fire because they have a bunch of vegetation, it puts your house at a higher risk of catching on fire as well. So it is a bit of a team effort for this to actually work. But then you get your whole street in line, then you get your whole city in line, and then if every single city in California did that, then this problem, which is extreme wildfire due to fuel accumulation and warmer and drier conditions, putting more life and property at risk, that problem would significantly decrease if each person just took care of their own household. And then once they had that taken care of, looked out to the community around them to see what else they could do and maybe who else they could help. For example, you don't want grandma on the roof using a leaf blower to get the leaves out of the gutter. That's maybe something that you could volunteer to go up to her house and do that for her. Something like that. That's just a small example. But I do think it's also important to realize that this isn't just something that you have to do. It's something that you could almost view as you get to do. For example, there's a lot of different problems out there. And I think it's very easy to look to the biggest problems possible and get very excited about those huge problems and to get all fired up about it and read a bunch about it and watch a bunch of videos about it. But then at the end of the day, you don't actually do anything to solve that problem. And perhaps we engage in this behavior, at least sometimes I do, because maybe it gives you a nice sense of morality or maybe even superiority because you're trying to take on the biggest problems in the world. But maybe it's also just a little bit of a cop-out out of laziness because you get the feeling that you're working on some huge problem without actually doing any work. But it's kind of just a false reality that you're creating, and deep down inside, I think everybody knows when they're doing that and knows when they're not actually making progress. And it can, I think, sometimes lead to cynicism and sometimes just lead to a negative outlook when you view these big problems, but you don't actually feel like you're working towards it. For example, just going into psychology and neuroscience a little bit, our brains are set up so that when we set a goal and we work towards that goal, it releases dopamine in your brain. So having a target, moving towards that target actually makes you, I don't know if you want to say happy, you could say joyful, that's maybe the better word. Or it provides meaning to your life. So if you just have these huge problems that you're not working towards, then you don't get that natural benefit of moving closer towards your goal. So that's why I think Wildfire is something that people can get excited about because it's a big enough of a goal that I think people can view it as something that's important. It's at the end of the day, it's protecting your life, your family, your property, your community, the ecosystem. Can't think of many things that are of higher value than that. But at the same time, there's actionable steps that you can take every single day to actually work towards that goal. For example, if you go out on your roof and you blow your gutters, then your house is now much safer than it was before. That's one of the main ways that houses burn down during fires is embers go in your gutters, start the fire up there, and then your house catches on fire. So that's a very small task. You do that, then you get that little dopamine hit knowing that you did your part today to not only make you and your house and your family a little safer, but your entire community as well. Because if your house is a giant tinderbox, then that's worse for your neighbors, and then that can turn into a chain reaction in a bad direction. So when you do something good, it can also lead to a chain reaction in a good direction. And our bad actions and our good actions do ripple across space and time. So you can't downplay something that seems as small as just clearing out your gutters. So I think maybe I'll leave that there. I intended on this video being concise, but yeah, I don't think it ended up being very concise. Maybe I get a little excited talking about Wildfire, but I'm certainly going to continue to be excited talking about Wildfire as I work my way through this textbook. I'm on about page 100. I think there's something like 500 pages in the book, so I'll be continuing to talk for quite some time. And if you want to learn more about Wildfire, you can stay tuned, and thanks for watching.